Hello everyone, I'm the Story Keeper, and I'm here to help you relax and fall asleep. Before we get into it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time is it where you're watching? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, relax, and let the story unfold through me. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the vast expanse of road ahead. Oliver Wright, a solo traveler from England, adjusted his sunglasses and smiled to himself as he gripped the steering wheel of his rented sedan. The hum of the engine, the open road, and the endless possibilities of his journey filled him with a rare sense of freedom. This trip was supposed to be his great escape, a chance to leave the monotony of life back home behind and experience the wide, open landscapes of America. Oliver had always been fascinated by the idea of a road trip. Growing up in the rainy, narrow streets of England, he had spent hours watching American movies filled with sprawling highways and endless horizons. Now, here he was, living out his dream. The plan was simple. Drive through as many states as he could in 2 weeks, stopping wherever the road took him. His itinerary so far had been relaxed. After landing in New York and spending a day exploring the city, he had driven westward, taking in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania before venturing into Ohio. He was currently en route to Kentucky, planning to stop in Louisville for some sightseeing and perhaps a glass of bourbon. The air conditioning hummed softly, and the GPS on his phone displayed a steady countdown to his next destination. He had his music playlist on shuffle, alternating between upbeat tracks and slower, more atmospheric tunes. Everything felt perfect until the car started to sputter. It started as a faint hiccup, a barely noticeable stutter in the car's steady rhythm. Oliver frowned, turning down the music to listen more closely. The sputtering grew worse, the car jolting slightly with each interruption. Before he could pull over, the engine let out a final groan and died completely. "Great," Oliver muttered, coasting to the side of the road. He put the car in park and turned the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to start. The dashboard lit up with ominous warning lights, and Oliver let out a frustrated sigh. He stepped out of the car, the heat of the afternoon sun hitting him like a wave. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, with no other vehicles in sight. Tall trees lined the edges, their dense foliage creating long, creeping shadows. Oliver glanced at his phone, relieved to see he still had a signal. He called the rental company, explaining his predicament. After what felt like an eternity on hold, a representative informed him that the nearest tow truck was at least an hour away. Oliver groaned, leaning against the side of the car. "Guess I'll have to wait," he muttered. True to their word, the tow truck arrived an hour later. The driver, a burly man in his 50s with a friendly smile, greeted Oliver with a nod. "Looks like you've got some bad luck, friend," he said, inspecting the car. "Let's get her to a garage." "Thanks," Oliver replied, climbing into the passenger seat of the truck. "Any decent garages around here?" The driver chuckled. "There's a place in town. Small operation, but they're good folks. Should be able to fix you up." As they drove, the landscape shifted. The trees grew denser, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The road narrowed, and the cheerful open skies gave way to a gloomier, more oppressive atmosphere. Oliver couldn't help but feel uneasy, though he told himself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. The tow truck rolled into a small town that looked like it had been plucked from another era. The streets were narrow, lined with weathered buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of time. A single traffic light blinked yellow at an empty intersection, and the few people Oliver saw on the sidewalks moved slowly, their faces etched with a weariness that was hard to ignore. "This is it," the driver said, pulling into the lot of a small garage. The sign above the entrance read, "Henry's Auto Repair," in peeling letters. A tall, thin man in greasy overalls emerged from the building, wiping his hands on a rag. "You got a live one for me, Joe?" the man called out, squinting at Oliver. "Yep." Car gave out on him a few miles up the road, the driver replied. He turned to Oliver. "This here's Henry. He'll take care of you." Oliver climbed out of the truck, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "Thanks for the help," he said to the driver before turning to Henry. "How long do you think it'll take to fix?" Henry scratched his head, his expression thoughtful. "Depends on what's wrong. Leave it with me, and I'll take a look. Might be a day or two, though." Oliver sighed. "I guess I'll need a place to stay." "There's a motel down the road," Henry said, jerking his thumb toward the end of the street. "Rustwood Inn. It's not fancy, but it'll do." The motel looked as though it hadn't been updated in decades. Its faded sign flickered weakly, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Oliver walked into the lobby, which smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. A woman sat behind the front desk, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Room for one?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yes," Oliver replied, trying to sound cheerful despite the growing unease in his chest. The woman handed him a key, without asking for ID. "Room 7, she said, "end of the hall." Oliver took the key and headed down the dimly lit corridor. The carpet was threadbare, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. His room was small but functional, with a single bed, a battered dresser, and a tiny bathroom. The window looked out onto the parking lot, its glass cloudy with grime. "Home, sweet home," Oliver muttered, setting his bag on the bed. He tried to shake off the unease that had followed him since entering the town. It was just an old motel in a quiet place, nothing to worry about. As darkness fell, the town grew eerily silent. Oliver sat on the bed, scrolling through his phone, but the weak Wi-Fi signal made it nearly impossible to pass the time. He turned on the TV, but the only channels available were static-filled local broadcasts and an ancient sitcom he didn't recognize. Eventually, he gave up and turned off the lights, lying back on the bed. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the faint creaks of the building settling. Just as he was beginning to drift off, he heard a soft, scratching sound coming from the window. Oliver froze, his heart pounding. He sat up slowly, his eyes fixed on the glass. The scratching continued, faint but persistent. Summoning his courage, he approached the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The parking lot was empty, illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. Oliver let out a shaky breath and returned to the bed, but the uneasy feeling remained. The motel room grew colder as the hours stretched on. Oliver lay awake, staring at the stained ceiling as the faint scratching noise he had heard earlier replayed in his mind. He told himself it was just his imagination, or perhaps the wind brushing a tree branch against the window butt. The uneasy feeling lingered. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed faintly, its red numbers flickering slightly. It was just past midnight, and the silence in the room was oppressive. Oliver turned onto his side, pulling the thin blanket closer around him. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep. Then he heard it, again a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Oliver sat up abruptly, his heart pounding. He strained his ears, trying to make sense of the sound. The whisper came again, just barely audible, as though someone were speaking from a great distance. It was too faint to understand, but the tone was unsettling low, urgent and insistent. "Hello?" Oliver called out, his voice breaking the silence. He immediately regretted it, the sound of his own voice only amplifying the eerie atmosphere. The whisper stopped, leaving only the faint hum of the motel's aging air conditioning unit. He climbed out of bed, his feet brushing against the rough carpet as he made his way toward the window. Peering through the grimy glass, he scanned the parking lot. It was empty, the single streetlight casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. "This is ridiculous," Oliver muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. "I'm just tired." He returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence of the motel seemed to amplify every creak, every groan of the old building. Hours passed, or at least it felt like they did, and Oliver lay there in the dark, his nerves on edge. The next morning, Oliver woke groggy and irritable. He wasn't even sure when he had finally fallen asleep, but it hadn't been restful. After a quick shower in the lukewarm trickle the motel called water pressure, he headed out into town. Henry, the mechanic, greeted him with a nod as he approached the garage. "Bad news, friend," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Your car needs a part we don't have in stock. I've ordered it, but it won't be here for another 2 days." Oliver sighed, the prospect of staying longer in the strange little town filling him with dread. "All right," he said. "Thanks for letting me know." Henry gave him a sympathetic look. "If you need anything, let me know. Not much happens around here, but the diner down the street has decent coffee." Oliver nodded and made his way to the diner. The place was as unremarkable as the rest of the town, a small, dimly lit room with a counter and a handful of booths. He ordered a coffee and a sandwich, hoping the simple meal would lift his spirits. The locals in the diner gave him curious looks, their conversations lowering to whispers as he entered. Oliver ignored them, focusing on his food. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time he returned to the motel, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Oliver's unease grew as he stepped back into his room, the air inside feeling heavier than it had that morning. The night passed much like the previous one, fitful and restless. Oliver lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. The whispers returned, louder this time, and more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, their indistinct tones filling the room like a cold wind. Oliver sat up, his body tense. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Oliver got out of bed and checked the window again. The parking lot was empty, the flickering streetlight casting its unsteady glow over the cracked asphalt. He checked the door, making sure it was locked, then returned to bed. But the whispers weren't finished. Sometime after midnight, Oliver heard a new sound, a faint shuffling noise, like footsteps in the hallway outside his room. His heart raced as he sat up, his ears straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer to his door before stopping abruptly. Oliver held his breath, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Then, to his horror, the doorknob rattled softly. He froze, his mind racing. Was someone trying to get in? The motel's flimsy lock didn't feel like much of a barrier, and Oliver cursed himself for not bringing anything to defend himself. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The doorknob stopped rattling, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Oliver crept toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening for any sign of movement. A sudden knock made him jump back, his pulse racing. He stared at the door, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "What do you want?" he called out. There was no answer, Just silence. Oliver didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, clutching the lamp from the nightstand as a makeshift weapon. The whispers returned briefly, but they were quieter now, as though whatever had been outside his door was retreating. When dawn finally broke, Oliver felt a rush of relief. The sunlight streaming through the window chased away the shadows, making the room feel less threatening. He quickly got dressed and left the motel, eager to escape its oppressive atmosphere. Oliver spent the day exploring the town, hoping to distract himself from the events of the night before. He visited the local library, a small building with creaky wooden floors and shelves lined with dusty books. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, watched him closely as he browsed. "Looking for something in particular?" she asked. "Just curious about the town," Oliver said. "It's an interesting place." The librarian gave him a thin smile. "Not much happens here," she said. "Most folks pass through and don't stay long." Oliver nodded, though her words didn't reassure him. He spent the rest of the day wandering the quiet streets, his unease growing with each passing hour. By the time he returned to the motel, the sun was beginning to set, and the shadows were growing longer. Oliver approached the Rustwood Inn with a sense of dread. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the parking lot, and the flickering motel sign buzzed faintly in the still air. Something about the place felt wrong, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for nightfall to reveal its true nature. He hesitated at the door to his room, the key heavy in his hand. Part of him wanted to leave, to drive to the next town and find a new place to stay, but his car was still out of commission, and the thought of wandering into the unknown was equally unsettling. "Get a grip," Oliver muttered to himself, unlocking the door. The room smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning chemicals, the same as the day before. He set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes scanning the familiar yet unwelcoming space. Determined to learn more about the motel, Oliver decided to talk to the woman at the front desk. The lobby was dimly lit, the overhead light buzzing faintly as the woman sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. She looked up as Oliver entered, her expression guarded. "Something wrong with your room?" she asked, her voice flat. "No, it's fine," Oliver replied, though the words felt like a lie. "I was just wondering, has this place always been so quiet?" The woman arched an eyebrow. "Quiet's what folks like about it," she said. "Not much traffic through here." Oliver nodded, trying to keep his tone casual. "I thought I heard someone in the hallway last night. Figured maybe there were other guests." The woman's expression didn't change. "You're the only one staying here," she said. "Must have been your imagination." Oliver's stomach turned. He wanted to ask more questions, but the woman's disinterested gaze made it clear she wasn't in the mood for small talk. He thanked her and returned to his room, the unease in his chest growing stronger. That evening, Oliver decided to explore the motel. Something about the place felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was hiding something. Armed with his phone's flashlight, he stepped into the dimly lit hallway and began walking. The hallway was eerily silent, the worn carpet muffling his footsteps. The numbered doors stretched into the darkness, each one identical to his own. Oliver passed room 7, the room he was staying in, and continued down the corridor. As he reached the end, he noticed something strange. The numbers on the last few doors didn't match the pattern of the others. Room 12 was followed by room 14, but there was no room 13. Curiosity got the better of him. He stopped in front of the blank space where room 13 should have been, running his hand over the wall. It felt solid, but the faint outline of a door was visible beneath the peeling wallpaper. Oliver's pulse quickened. Why would the motel hide a room? He pressed his ear against the wall, straining to hear anything on the other side. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, he heard the same whispering he'd heard the night before. Oliver stepped back, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder, their indistinct words overlapping in a chaotic symphony. He fumbled for the doorknob of room 14, desperate to get away, but the door was locked. "Hello?" Oliver called out, his voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the hallway in complete silence. Oliver's heart raced as he backed away, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He returned to his room, locking the door behind him and leaning against it for support. Back in the safety of his room, Oliver tried to make sense of what he had seen. The hidden room, the whisper seat, all felt surreal, like something out of a dream. He sat on the bed, staring at the blank wall as his mind raced. Needing a distraction, he opened the small desk drawer beside the bed. Inside was a worn leather notebook, its edges frayed and its cover scratched. Curious, Oliver flipped it open, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes. The writing was messy, the ink smudged in places, but Oliver could make out enough to understand that the notes belonged to someone who had stayed at the motel before him. The entries described strange occurrences, noises in the night, objects moving on their own, and a persistent feeling of being watched. The final entry sent a chill down Oliver's spine. "There's something in room 13. I can feel it watching me. I'm leaving tonight. If you're reading this, don't stay." That night, Oliver lay awake, the notebook's final words replaying in his mind. He had locked the door and propped a chair beneath the doorknob, but it did little to ease his anxiety. The motel was silent, the oppressive stillness broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. As the hours dragged on, Oliver began to drift off, his exhaustion outweighing his fear. But just as he was about to fall asleep, a loud knock jolted him upright. The sound was sharp and insistent, coming from the wall where room 13 should have been. Oliver's heart pounded as he stared at the blank space, his mind racing. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural whisper. "Leave," the voice said, the word drawn out and filled with malice. Oliver grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The wall was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. He stumbled to the door, unlocking it and stepping into the hallway. The corridor was empty, the flickering overhead light casting uneven shadows on the walls. Oliver's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around, his flashlight sweeping over the closed doors. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was worse. He didn't go back to his room that night. Instead, he sat in the motel lobby, his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the hallway. The front desk clerk was nowhere to be seen, and the lobby's dim lighting did little to comfort him. He waited for dawn, his mind racing with questions and fears. Oliver barely slept after the events of the previous night. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows of the motel lobby, he finally allowed himself to relax, though the tension in his chest remained. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, questions, and fears. What was behind the wall where room 13 should have been? Why was the motel hiding it? And, most importantly, what had he heard last night? He stood and stretched, his back aching from the uncomfortable chair he had spent the night in. Determined to get some answers, he made his way back to his room to collect his belongings before heading out. The air in the hallway felt heavier than before, as though the motel itself was aware of his intentions. As Oliver approached room 7, he noticed a man standing at the end of the hallway. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the rundown motel. The man's face was pale, his expression unreadable as he stared directly at Oliver. "Can I help you?" Oliver asked, his voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He stood motionless for a moment longer before turning and walking away, disappearing around the corner without a sound. Oliver felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the man felt wrong, unnatural, even. He hurried back into his room, locking the door behind him. He needed to leave this place, but first he needed answers. Later that morning, Oliver walked to Henry's auto repair, the sun's warmth doing little to dispel the unease that clung to him. Henry greeted him with a friendly nod, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Car's coming along," Henry said. "Should be ready by tomorrow." Oliver hesitated, then decided to broach the subject that had been weighing on him. "Can I ask you something, Henry? About the motel?" Henry's expression darkened slightly. "Rustwood. What about it? Have you ever noticed anything strange about it?" Oliver asked carefully, like sounds in the night, or a hidden room. Henry's eyes narrowed, and he glanced around as though checking to see if anyone was listening. "You're not the first person to say that," he said quietly. "That place has been around a long time, longer than it should have been." "What do you mean?" Oliver pressed. Henry sighed. "Look, I don't know the details, but there are stories. People say the original owner built the motel on cursed land. Folks who stay there too long start hearing things, seeing things. Most people leave before it gets worse." Oliver's stomach turned. "What happens if they stay?" Henry shook his head. "You don't want to know." Oliver spent the rest of the day in the town's library, determined to learn more about the motel's history. The librarian, the same elderly woman he had spoken to before, raised an eyebrow as he approached. "Back again?" she asked. "What are you looking for this time?" "I'm trying to find information about the Rustwood Inn," Oliver said. "Do you have any records about it?" The librarian frowned, but led him to a dusty filing cabinet in the back of the room. "Not much to go on," she said, "but you might find something in here." Oliver sifted through the files, his heart racing as he uncovered old newspaper clippings and property records. One article, dated nearly 50 years ago, caught his eye. "Local motel owner mysteriously disappears." The article described the disappearance of the motel's original owner, a man named Edgar Holt. According to the report, Holt had been a reclusive man who rarely left the property. One day he vanished without a trace, leaving the motel to fall into disrepair. Another clipping detailed a series of strange incidents at the motel over the years, guests reporting unexplained noises, sightings of shadowy figures, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Some even claimed that Holt's spirit still lingered, trapped within the motel's walls. Oliver's hands trembled as he read the final article. Room 13, the motel's darkest secret. The article was brief but chilling. It mentioned a guest who had stayed in room 13 and reportedly experienced terrifying visions before fleeing the motel in the middle of the night. Shortly after, the room was sealed off, and its existence was erased from the motel's records. Armed with this new information, Oliver returned to the motel as the sun dipped below the horizon. The flickering sign cast eerie shadows across the parking lot as he approached. He felt a growing sense of dread, but he couldn't leave without uncovering the truth. He stood in front of the wall where room 13 should have been, his flashlight illuminating the faint outline of the door. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder as he placed his hand against the wall. "Show me," Oliver whispered, his voice trembling. The wall felt cold beneath his palm, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, With a low groan, the faint outline of the door began to glow, the symbols etched into its surface coming to life. Oliver stepped back, his heart racing as the walls seemed to ripple like water. The whispers grew louder, filling the hallway with their chaotic chorus. Oliver felt a cold wind rush past him, and the door to room 13 materialized before his eyes. Oliver hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave the motel and never look back, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. He turned the knob slowly, the door creaking open to reveal a room bathed in dim, flickering light. The air inside was heavy and cold, the scent of mildew and decay filling his nostril. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. At the center of the room stood a single chair, its back facing him. As Oliver stepped inside, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, pressing against his ears like a physical weight. He approached the chair cautiously, his flashlight shaking in his hand. When he reached the chair, he found it empty, but carved into the backrest were the words. Oliver stared at the words carved into the chair's back, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear his own thoughts. The air in room 13 was thick, heavy with a sense of malice that made it hard to breathe. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt even more sinister. He took a step back, his flashlight casting shaky beams of light across the room. The dust-covered floor showed no signs of footprints, as though no one had stepped inside for decades. Yet the chair's message was fresh, the carved letters sharp and deliberate. Oliver felt the urge to run, to escape the motel and its eerie secrets, but something held him in place. He had come this far, there had to be an explanation. Swallowing his fear, he turned his flashlight toward the rest of the room, scanning the walls for anything that might explain the haunting atmosphere. The peeling wallpaper revealed strange markings beneath it, symbols etched directly into the plaster. They were unlike anything Oliver had ever seen, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer in the flickering light. He reached out to touch one of the symbols, but the moment his fingers brushed the surface, a sharp jolt shot through his arm. "Leave," a voice hissed, low and guttural, reverberating through the room. Oliver stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. Panic surged through him as the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than before. Desperately, Oliver picked up his flashlight and aimed it at the chair. To his horror, it was no longer empty. A figure sat there now, shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated a cold, suffocating dread. The figure's head tilted slowly, as though studying him, and the whispers grew louder, their tones filled with anger and despair. Oliver didn't wait to see what the figure would do next. He turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he bolted down the hallway. The whispers followed him, their disembodied voices echoing through the motel like a twisted symphony. As he reached the door to his room, the air grew colder and the lights in the hallway flickered violently. Oliver fumbled with the key, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock the door. The whispers were right behind him now, so loud they felt as though they were inside his head. Finally, the key turned, and he stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an eerie silence. Oliver grabbed the leather notebook from the desk drawer and flipped through its pages, searching for anything that might explain what he had just experienced. The final entry stood out again, Room 13 is the source, the heart of the motel's darkness. If you see it, if you enter it, you won't leave the same. It watches, it waits, don't let it take you. The words sent a chill down Oliver's spine. He had ignored the warning, and now he wasn't sure if he could escape. He paced the room, his mind racing. The motel wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding off the fear and despair of those who stayed within its walls. As the hours passed, Oliver tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually overtook him. He drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with shadowy figures and the incessant whispers of Room 13. When Oliver woke, the sun was shining brightly through the grimy window, and the motel seemed almost normal. The oppressive atmosphere of the night before had lifted, but the memory of what he had seen lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. Determined to leave, Oliver packed his belongings and headed to the garage. Henry greeted him with a grin, his hands covered in grease. "Your car's ready," Henry said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Good, as new." Oliver nodded, relieved. "Thanks, Henry. I appreciate it." As Henry handed him the keys, he hesitated. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Oliver forced a smile. "Just didn't sleep well. I'm glad to be moving on." Henry's expression turned serious. "You be careful out there," he said. "This town has a way of sticking with people." Oliver drove away from the Rustwood Inn, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The small town disappeared in his rearview mirror, its eerie streets fading into the distance. He didn't look back, afraid of what he might see if he did. As the miles passed, the tension in his chest began to ease. The open road stretched out before him, a welcome contrast to the claustrophobic darkness of the motel. He rolled down the window, letting the fresh air clear his mind. But as he drove, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. The motel was behind him, but its presence wasn't gone. He could still feel it, like a shadow clinging to his thoughts. And deep down, he knew the Rustwood Inn wasn't finished with him. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt winding through hills and forests. Oliver kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel firm, as if holding on tighter would distance him from the memories of the Rustwood Inn. The eerie events of the past 3 days felt like a bad dream, but the gnawing unease in his chest reminded him they were all too real. The rental car's engine hummed steadily, and the sunlight filtering through the trees should have been comforting. Instead, every shadow seemed to flicker unnaturally, and every gust of wind felt like a whisper brushing against his ear. Oliver shook his head, trying to clear the intrusive thoughts. The road ahead was vast, and he had plenty of miles to put between himself and the motel. About an hour into the drive, Oliver noticed something odd. The highway signs, weathered but legible, seemed to carry an uncanny familiarity. Exit 12, Rustwood, 5 miles, one read. Oliver frowned, his pulse quickening. He had left the Rustwood Inn behind, he was sure of it. The town was miles in the opposite direction, and he had stayed on the main highway without taking a single detour. He glanced at the GPS on his phone, but the screen was blank, the app frozen on a loading symbol. The next sign only deepened his unease. "Welcome to Rustwood," it read in faded letters, its edges overgrown with vines. Oliver's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he sped past it, his heart pounding in his chest. "This can't be right," he muttered, his voice trembling. He reached for the map he had stuffed into the glove compartment, but as he unfolded it, the ink seemed smudged and unreadable, the once clear roads now twisting into nonsensical patterns. Oliver tried to rationalize what was happening. He must have made a wrong turn, taken an unmarked detour without realizing it. But the more he drove, the more the landscape around him began to resemble the outskirts of Rustwood, the dense forests, the narrow road, the oppressive shadows. Then he saw it, the flickering neon sign of the Rustwood Inn, glowing faintly in the distance. "No," Oliver whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "This isn't possible." He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly as it came to a stop. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing. He couldn't have returned. He had driven for hours, heading west away from the motel, away from the town. And yet, there it was, standing exactly as he had left it. Desperate for answers, Oliver turned the car around and drove back toward the main highway. He would find a gas station, a dune anywhere with people who could tell him where he was. The road stretched on, the trees closing in around him like a tunnel. He drove for what felt like an eternity, but the highway signs were gone, replaced by the same repeating landmarks. Finally, he spotted a small convenience store on the side of the road. The building was old, its paint peeling, and its windows clouded with dirt. A single gas pump stood out front, its nozzle resting on the ground as if abandoned mid-use. Oliver parked and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. The air was thick and humid, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and decay. He pushed open the door, the bell above it jangling faintly. The store was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically. Shelves lined with dusty cans and faded labels stretched toward the back, where a lone clerk sat behind the counter. The man was hunched over, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. "Excuse me," Oliver said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "Can you tell me where I am?" The clerk didn't look up. "You're in Rustwood," he said flatly. Oliver's stomach dropped. "That's not possible," he said, his voice rising. "I left Rustwood hours ago. I've been driving west." The clerk chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Rustwood doesn't let go easy," he said. "You might think you've left, but you're still here. Always will be." Oliver backed away, his heart racing as the clerk's words sank in. He turned and ran out of the store, the bell jangling behind him. The car was still running, and he climbed in, slamming the door shut. He drove aimlessly, his mind clouded with panic. Every road seemed to loop back on itself, every turn bringing him closer to the Rustwood Inn. It was as if the town had become a maze, trapping him within its boundaries. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road. Oliver's exhaustion grew, the weight of fear pressing heavily on his chest. He pulled over to the side of the road, unable to drive any further. His hands trembled as he rested them on the steering wheel, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The silence was deafening. As darkness fell, the shadows around the car seemed to deepen. Oliver felt the familiar sense of being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He turned on the headlights, their beams cutting through the gloom, but they illuminated nothing but the empty road ahead. Then he saw it. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the faint light. It was the same man he had seen in the motel hallway, the pale face, the dark suit. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching. Oliver's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He turned the car's ignition, the engine roaring to life, and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The figure didn't move as the car sped past, its form dissolving into the shadows. But as Oliver glanced in the rear-view mirror, he saw the man again closer this time, his face illuminated by the red glow of the tail lights. Oliver drove aimlessly through the night, his fear turning to desperation. No matter which direction he went, the Rustwood Inn loomed in the distance, its flickering sign a constant reminder of his entrapment. Finally, as exhaustion overtook him, he pulled into the motel's parking lot. He sat in the car for a long moment, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The whispers had returned, faint and insistent, their tones filled with malice. He stepped out of the car and approached the lobby, the heavy air pressing against him like a physical weight. The door creaked open, and the same woman sat behind the desk, her sharp eyes watching him. "Welcome back," she said, a faint smile playing at her lips. Oliver didn't respond. He took the key she handed him and walked down the dimly lit hallway to room 7. As he opened the door, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their eerie chorus. He was back where he had started. The stale air of room 7 greeted Oliver like an old enemy. He stood in the doorway, the whispers clawing at his ears as if they had been waiting for his return. The oppressive sense of dread he'd felt before was now suffocating, and his legs trembled as he stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the silence that followed. The whispers faded momentarily, leaving only the faint hum of the air conditioning. Oliver placed his bag on the bed, his hands shaking as he tried to focus. "You have to think," he muttered to himself, pacing the room. "There has to be a way out of this." Desperate for answers, Oliver retrieved the smudged mat from his bag. Its roads were still twisted and distorted, but now there were faint markings he hadn't noticed before, lines and symbols drawn in a shaky hand. They seemed to converge at one point, which he recognized as the location of the Rustwood Inn. "What is this place?" Oliver whispered, tracing the lines with his finger. The symbols were eerily similar to the ones he had seen carved into the walls of room 13. As he studied the map, the air in the room grew colder. Oliver's breath came in visible puffs, and the lights flickered overhead. He felt the now familiar sensation of being watched, and his eyes darted to the mirror above the dresser. A figure stood behind him. Oliver froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure was the same man from the hallway, and the road pale, gaunt, and dressed in a dark suit. He stood motionless, his expression unreadable, his hollow eyes locked onto Oliver's reflection. Oliver spun around, but the room was empty. The mirror, however, still held the man's image, his presence lingering as if the glass had trapped him. "Why are you doing this to me?" Oliver demanded, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, but the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to emanate from the mirror, their tones burgeoned and filled with malice. Oliver grabbed a chair and swung it at the mirror, the glass shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. As the glass shards settled, Oliver noticed something strange. Behind the broken mirror was a hidden compartment, its interior lined with old, yellowed papers. He reached inside and pulled them out, his hands trembling as he unfolded them. The papers appeared to be journal entries, written in a hurried, scrawled hand. They described the Rustwood Inn, in unsettling detail the strange phenomena, the whispers, and the recurring figure of the man in the suit. One entry caught Oliver's eye. "This place is a trap, feeding on those who pass through. It twists the roads, pulls you back no matter how far you try to go. The man in the suit is its harbinger, a warning, or perhaps its agent. If you see him, it's already too late." Another entry was even more chilling. "Room 13 is the heart of it all. Whatever power sustains the motel resides there. Destroy it, and maybe you can escape. But beware, once you've opened that door, the motel will fight to keep you." Oliver's hands tightened around the papers as a wave of determination surged through him. He had to go back to room 13. If the journal was right, it was the only way to break free. Oliver spent the next hour preparing himself. He found a heavy wrench in his bagatool he borrowed from Henry's garage and held it tightly in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The hallway was eerily quiet as he stepped outside, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the worn carpet. The air felt heavier with each step he took toward the end of the hall, where room 13 waited. The door to room 13 was visible now, its outline faintly glowing with the same strange symbols he had seen before. The whispers grew louder as he approached, their overlapping voices creating an unsettling cacophony. Oliver hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Fear clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to push it aside. He turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was darker than before, its air thick with an unplaceable stench. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, their shifting patterns almost hypnotic. The chair in the center of the room was gone, replaced by a small, blackened altar that pulsed with an eerie light. Oliver's flashlight flickered as he approached the altar, his every step feeling like a struggle against an unseen force. The whispers reached a deafening pitch, their words incomprehensible but filled with rage. He raised the wrench, his knuckles white as he prepared to strike the altar. The whispers seemed to scream in protest, and the air around him grew colder. Shadows coalesced in the corners of the room, their shapes twisting and writhing as though alive. Before he could swing, the man in the suit appeared again, standing between Oliver and the altar. His hollow eyes glinted in the faint light, and his presence radiated an overwhelming sense of dread. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice low and resonant. "Leave." "I can't," Oliver replied, his voice shaking. "Not until this is over." The man tilted his head, as though considering Oliver's words. Then he stepped aside, his form dissolving into shadows. The altar pulsed one final time, its glow growing brighter, as though daring Oliver to destroy it. With a shout, Oliver brought the wrench down onto the altar, the impact sending a shockwave through the room. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the symbols on the walls flared brightly before fading into darkness. The ground beneath Oliver's feet trembled, and the walls of the room began to crack and crumble. He stumbled back, shielding his face, as pieces of the ceiling fell around him. The oppressive weight of the motel's presence lifted, replaced by a sudden stillness. Oliver ran, the hallway collapsing behind him as he sprinted toward the lobby. The air was filled with dust and the sound of splintering wood, but he didn't stop until he burst through the front doors and into the parking lot. The Rustwood Inn was falling apart, its structure consumed by shadows that seemed to devour it from within. Oliver climbed into his car and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the swirling dust as he sped away. As Oliver drove, the road ahead remained clear. The oppressive atmosphere of the town was gone, replaced by the open expanse of the countryside. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The Rustwood Inn was behind him, its dark grip finally broken. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw the faint outline of the man in the suit, watching him from the edge of the road. Oliver didn't look back. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the endless highway, yet Oliver couldn't shake the tension in his chest. He'd driven for hours, putting as much distance between himself and the Rustwood Inn as possible, but the sense of unease remained. The destruction of the motel should have been the end of it, yet he couldn't help but feel its presence clinging to him, like a shadow that refused to fade. The countryside was calm, the rolling hills dotted with patches of wildflowers. The car's engine hummed steadily, a reassuring constant in the quiet. But every now and then, Oliver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man in the suit standing on the side of the road. Around noon, Oliver pulled into a small rest stop. The lot was nearly empty, save for a battered pickup truck parked near the entrance and a vending machine that buzzed faintly in the shade of a tree. He stepped out of the car, stretching his legs as the fresh air filled his lungs. The rest stop was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of Rustwood. The birds chirped, the breeze rustled the leaves, and the sunlight felt warm on his skin. For a moment, Oliver allowed himself to relax. He bought a bottle of water from the vending machine and sat at a weathered picnic table, his thoughts drifting. The events of the past few days felt surreal, like fragments of a half-remembered nightmare. He took a sip of water and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of nature calm his frayed nerves. But the peace was short-lived. When Oliver opened his eyes, he noticed something strange on the picnic table. Carved into the wood, just beneath his hand, were the words, "It's not over." His stomach dropped. He ran his fingers over the carving, the grooves fresh and rough. He looked around, his heart racing, but the rest stop was empty. The pickup truck was gone, leaving only his car and the faint hum of the vending machine. Oliver stood abruptly, his pulse pounding in his ears. He scanned the area, half expecting to see the man in the suit emerging from the trees. But there was no one, only the empty road and the quiet rustling of the wind. He climbed back into his car and sped away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the miles stretched on, the unease in Oliver's chest grew. The open highway, once a symbol of freedom and adventure, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, and every turn in the road carried the weight of unseen eyes. The radio crackled faintly, static filling the cabin before a soft voice broke through. "Oliver," it whispered, low and distorted. He slammed the power button, cutting off the sound. His heart raced as he stared at the road ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The car felt smaller, the air inside heavier. "I'm losing it," he muttered to himself. "I'm just imagining things." But deep down, he knew the truth. The motel wasn't finished with him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Oliver found himself approaching another small town. A faded wooden sign on the side of the road read, "Welcome to Larkspur. Population 542. Unlike Rustwood, Larkspur seemed lively. The streets were lined with quaint houses, their porches adorned with flower pots and rocking chairs. A small diner glowed warmly at the center of town, its parking lot filled with cars. Oliver parked outside the diner, his stomach growling. He hadn't eaten all day, and the promise of a hot meal was too tempting to resist. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee greeted him. A waitress approached, her smile friendly. "Sit anywhere you like, hun," she said, gesturing to the booths along the window. Oliver chose a seat in the corner, his back to the wall. He scanned the menu quickly, ordering a burger and a coffee. The other patrons chatted quietly, their laughter and conversation a welcome distraction from his thoughts. For a brief moment, he felt normal again. As Oliver sipped his coffee, his eyes drifted to the window. The street outside was dimly lit, the glow of the diner's sign reflecting off the glass. For a moment, he thought he saw someone standing on the opposite side walk, a tall figure in a dark suit. His grip on the mug tightened. He blinked, and the figure was gone. The waitress returned with his food, her cheerful demeanor snapping him out of his thoughts. "You okay, hon?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Oliver forced a smile. I'm fine. Just tired. The waitress nodded, though her concern lingered. Well, eat up. You'll feel better after a good meal. After finishing his dinner, Oliver paid his bill and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. He leaned against his car, taking a moment to collect himself before continuing his journey. As he glanced at the diner's window, he noticed something strange. Written in the condensation on the glass, as if traced by an unseen hand, were the words, "You can't run." Oliver's chest tightened. He turned to look at the street, but it was empty. The other patrons inside the diner carried on as if nothing was wrong, their laughter and conversation undisturbed. He climbed into his car and started the engine, his hands trembling. The headlights cut through the darkness as he pulled onto the road, leaving Larkspur behind. As Oliver drove, the unease in his chest grew stronger. The shadows along the road seemed to shift and writhe, their shapes unnatural and unsettling. The whispering returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing mile. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a glowing sign flickering weakly against the night sky. His stomach dropped as the familiar words came into view. Rustwood Inn. No, Oliver whispered, his voice trembling. This isn't possible. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. The sign was still there, its flickering light mocking him. He closed his eyes, taking deep, shuddering breaths. When he opened them again, the sign was gone. The headlights illuminated the dark road ahead as Oliver gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the smooth surface. His breaths came shallow and quick. The lingering image of the Rustwood Inn's sign burned into his mind. Even though it was gone now, replaced by the empty stretch of highway, the fear remained. The car's engine hummed steadily, but the night felt anything but steady. The sense of dread that had followed him from Rustwood grew heavier, like a shroud wrapping tighter around his chest with every passing mile. After an hour of driving, Oliver spotted a gas station on the side of the road. Its fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the pumps. He glanced at the fuel gauge, relieved to see that he still had plenty of gas, but the thought of stepping out of the car was oddly tempting. He needed to feel grounded, to prove to himself that he wasn't trapped in some looping nightmare. He parked near the entrance and stepped out into the cool night air. The smell of gasoline and asphalt filled his nostrils, sharp and grounding. The station appeared deserted, the small convenience store behind the pumps empty except for the faint glow of a television flickering through the window. As Oliver approached the store, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass door. His face was pale, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, but something else caught his attention. Behind him, in the reflection, stood the man in the suit. Oliver whipped around, his heart pounding, but the lot was empty. The bell above the door jingled as Oliver stepped inside. The store was dimly lit, the shelves sparsely stocked with faded cans of food and dusty bottles of soda. A small TV mounted in the corner played an old black and white movie, its sound low and distorted. The clerk sat behind the counter, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He looked up as Oliver entered, his eyes sharp and alert. "Late night, huh?" the clerk said, his voice rough but casual. Oliver nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, just needed a break." The clerk smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Rodell do that to you? You headed anywhere in particular?" Oliver hesitated. He didn't want to talk about Rustwood or the strange experiences that had followed him, so he simply said, "Just passing through." The clerk nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Oliver for a moment too long. "Well, you take care out there. These roads can get strange." at night. After grabbing a bottle of water, Oliver returned to the car. The clerk's words played over in his mind, their tone unnervingly knowing. He pulled out of the gas station, the car's tires crunching over the gravel lot before hitting the smooth pavement of the highway. The road ahead stretched on, empty and dark. Oliver glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man in the suit standing in the distance. But the mirror reflected only the empty road behind him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. The soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic whir of the tires against the asphalt were almost soothing. Then, out of nowhere, a flash of light illuminated the road ahead, and he saw it. The words "turn back" were painted across the pavement in thick, white letters. Oliver slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. His chest heaved as he stared at the message, his headlights casting long shadows over the uneven surface of the road. The paint looked fresh, the edges of the letters sharp and clean. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold night air. The road was silent, the forest on either side eerily still. He knelt to touch the letters, half expecting them to smear under his fingers, but they didn't. The paint was dry. "What do you want from me?" Oliver shouted, his voice echoing into the emptiness. The forest remained silent. Oliver climbed back into the car, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. He drove forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the road for any other signs or messages. The car's headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, but every shadow seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Then, in the distance, he saw it again. The man in the suit. The figure stood in the middle of the road, motionless and unyielding. Oliver's heart pounded as he slowed the car to a stop. The man's face was obscured by shadow, but his presence was overwhelming, radiating an air of malice and authority. Oliver rolled down the window, his voice trembling as he called out, "What do you want?" The man didn't respond. He simply raised one hand, pointing to the side of the road. Oliver hesitated, his mind racing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It only stood there, its outstretched hand unwavering. Reluctantly, Oliver turned the car toward the direction the man had indicated. A narrow dirt road branched off the highway, leading into the dense forest. The car's tires crunched over the uneven surface as he followed the path, his headlights casting eerie shadows over the trees. After several minutes, the road opened up into a clearing. At its center stood an old, dilapidated house, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of decay. The air here was thick and heavy, the oppressive atmosphere reminiscent of rustwood. Oliver parked the car and stepped out, the cool night air biting at his skin. The house loomed before him, its warped wooden boards creaking in the faint breeze. He felt a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing him toward the front door. The whispers returned, faint and indistinct, as he climbed the steps and pushed the door open. The interior of the house was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Broken furniture and scattered debris littered the floor, and the wallpaper hung in tatters from the walls. Oliver's flashlight flickered as he moved through the rooms, the beam casting shifting shadows over the decaying surfaces. In the center of what appeared to be the living room, he found a small table. On it lay a single item, a framed photograph. Oliver picked up the frame, his breath catching in his throat. The photograph was old and faded, but he recognized the man in the suit standing among a group of people. The others were blurry, their faces indistinct, but the man's image was clear and sharp. Beneath the photograph, scrawled in faint, spidery handwriting, were the words, He watches, he waits, he chooses. Oliver stared at the photograph, his fingers trembling as he traced the edges of the faded image. The man in the suit seemed to radiate an air of authority, his expression calm yet unsettling. The words beneath the picture he watches, he waits, he chooses, echoed in Oliver's mind, their meaning gnawing at him. He set the frame down and stepped back, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows over the walls. The whispers that had been faint before grew louder, filling the room with their chaotic, overlapping tones. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, their words just out of reach. "What do you want from me?" Oliver shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. Then, faintly, a low, resonant voice spoke. "Stay." Oliver froze, his chest tightening as the word hung in the air. It wasn't a whisper this time, it was something deeper, more commanding. His flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as though the darkness were pressing against it. Then he saw it. A door at the far end of the room, its edges faintly glowing with the same symbols he had seen at the Rustwood Inn. It was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, Oliver stepped toward the door. He felt a strange compulsion, as though an unseen force were pulling him forward. The air grew colder with each step, his breath visible in the dim light. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, the sound echoing in the confined space. The walls were damp, the faint scent of mildew mingling with something sharper, metallic. At the bottom of the staircase, the space opened into a cavernous room. The basement was vast, its walls lined with jagged stone that seemed to glisten in the faint light. At the center of the room stood an altar, similar to the one Oliver had seen in room 13. Its surface was etched with intricate symbols that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, their tones filled with anger and despair. Oliver approached the altar cautiously, his heart pounding. Resting on the altar's surface was another photograph, this one newer and sharper than the last. It was of him. Oliver stumbled back, his mind reeling. The photograph showed him standing in front of the Rustwood Inn, his expression blank, his eyes hollow. Beneath the image, written in the same spidery handwriting, were the words. A shadow moved at the edge of the room, and Oliver spun around, his flashlight beam trembling. The man in the suit stepped into the light, his presence overwhelming. His hollow eyes bore into Oliver, and the whispers grew deafening. "Why me?" Oliver demanded, his voice shaking. "What is this?" The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You were drawn here," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "The house called to you. The motel, the road, all paths lead here." Oliver shook his head, his chest tightening. "I don't understand. Why? What do you want from me?" The man stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You are the next," he said, "to carry the burden, to keep it contained." The man gestured toward the altar, and the symbols on its surface flared brightly, illuminating the room in an eerie glow. Shadows danced on the walls, their shapes shifting and writhing as though alive. "The burden must be carried," the man continued, "to protect the world above. The darkness within these walls must be contained, or it will consume everything." Oliver's mind raced. He wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but the man's words rooted him in place. "I don't want this," he said, his voice breaking. didn't ask for this. No one does, the man replied. But the house chooses, and once chosen, there is no escape. Oliver's chest tightened as the weight of the man's words sank in. He glanced at the altar, the symbols glowing brighter with each passing moment. The whispers grew louder, their tones filled with anger and despair. "You have a choice," the man said. "Take the burden, or leave and let the darkness spread. The motel will return, and others will suffer in your place." Oliver's mind raced. He had spent days trying to escape the motel, the man, the whispers. But now he understood there was no escape. The only way to end it was to take on the responsibility himself. The man extended a hand, his expression unwavering. Decide. Oliver's hands trembled as he stared at the man. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his chest. He could leave, pretend none of this had happened, and hope the darkness wouldn't follow him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. With a deep, shuddering breath, Oliver stepped forward. He placed his hand on the altar, the cold surface sending a jolt of energy through his body. The symbols flared brightly, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The man in the suit stepped back, his hollow eyes fixed on Oliver. "It is done," he said simply. The room darkened, and the air grew still. When Oliver opened his eyes, he was standing outside the house. The car was gone, the road empty. In his hand was the photograph from the altar, its edges blackened and worn. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that felt both comforting and oppressive. Oliver looked back at the house, its windows dark and uninviting. He knew he couldn't leave now. The house was his to guard, the darkness within his to contain. As the sun rose over the horizon, Oliver stood alone, his shadow stretching long across the dirt road. The burden was his, and there was no turning back. The first days as the house's keeper were surreal. Oliver roamed the decaying halls, trying to understand the enormity of the task he had been thrust into. The oppressive atmosphere he had felt as a visitor was now a constant companion, but it no longer felt hostile. Instead, it was like a living, breathing presence that watched him, waiting for him to prove himself. The whispers were faint now, a background murmur that rose and fell like distant waves. The symbols itched into the walls, and altar pulsed faintly, their light a constant reminder of the house's power. Oliver spent hours studying them, tracing their patterns and trying to decipher their meaning. The man in the suit hadn't returned, but Oliver could feel his presence. It was as though he were lingering, just out of sight, observing, judging. And then there was the house itself, a labyrinth of rooms and corridors that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. No matter how many steps he took, Oliver never felt like he reached the edges of its secrets. The first task the house demanded of him came on the third night. Oliver was sitting in what he now considered the main rumor-dusty parlor with a fireplace that hadn't seen flames in decades when the whispers grew louder. He stood, his pulse quickening as the air around him thickened. The whispers led him to a door he hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others, tucked into the corner of a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. The door creaked open as he approached, revealing a spiral staircase descending into the earth. Oliver hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had come to accept that the house was alive, that it had chosen him, but descending into its depths felt like a final step, a point of no return. Still, he knew he couldn't refuse. The staircase was cold and damp, the stone steps worn smooth by time. The air grew heavier the deeper he went, and the faint glow of the symbols on the walls provided just enough light to guide him. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a cavernous room filled with shadowy figures. The figures weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They stood motionless, their forms shrouded in darkness that seemed to pulse and shift. Their eyes glowed faintly, their gazes fixed on Oliver as he entered. The whispers swirled around him, growing louder until they coalesced into words. They watch, they protect, they judge. Oliver swallowed hard, his pulse racing. The figures didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming, their combined energy pressing against him like a tidal wave. He felt as though he were being weighed, measured, and evaluated. After what felt like an eternity, the whispers subsided, and the figures faded into the shadows. The room grew still, and the symbols on the walls flared brightly for a moment, before dimming again. Oliver exhaled shakily, his body trembling from the encounter. Over the following weeks, Oliver began to understand the nature of the house and its connection to the world beyond. The whispers spoke to him more clearly now, their words fragmented but meaningful. The house wasn't just a prison, for the darkness within it was a barrier, a shield against forces that sought to escape into the world above. The man in the suit returned occasionally, always appearing when Oliver least expected him. He never stayed long, and his cryptic words offered little comfort. The balance must be maintained, he would say. The house endures because you endure. Oliver found himself drawn to the altar more frequently, its symbols pulsing faintly whenever he approached. It was the heart of the house, the source of its power, and the key to keeping the darkness contained. He spent hours studying it, trying to understand its connection to the symbols that adorned the walls. One night, as Oliver lay in the small room he had claimed as his own, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was faint at first, barely audible over the murmur of the whispers, but it grew steadily louder, sharp, insistent knocking at the front door. Oliver stood, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen another human since becoming the keeper, and the thought of someone finding the house filled him with both hope and dread. The knocking continued, relentless and demanding. When he reached the door, he hesitated. The whispers grew louder, their tones urgent and warning. But something compelled him to open it. Standing on the porch was a woman. She was young, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Her clothes were torn, and she looked as though she had been running for miles. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need help." Oliver's mind raced. The house wasn't a place. For outsiders it was a prison, a barrier, and a curse. But the woman's fear was real, and he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The whispers grew louder, their tones sharp and disapproving, but Oliver ignored them. The woman collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling as she tried to catch her breath. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something was chasing me. I didn't know where else to go. Oliver knelt beside her, his chest tightening. "What was it?" he asked. "What were you running from?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. Shadows. They came out of nowhere." Oliver's stomach turned. The house wasn't supposed to let anyone in, and yet here she was, bringing with her a darkness that felt all too familiar. The woman's arrival marked the beginning of something new. The house grew restless, its walls groaning and shifting as though in protest. The whispers turned into a cacophony, their tones filled with urgency and anger. Oliver tried to comfort the woman, but her fear only grew. "They're still here," she whispered, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. "I can feel them." The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, their edges flickering unnaturally. Oliver felt the oppressive weight of the Watcher's gaze, their presence a reminder of his responsibilities. He had to make a choice: protect the woman or protect the house. The woman's fear was palpable, her trembling form a stark contrast to the oppressive stillness of the house. Oliver stood frozen, torn between his duty to the house and the human instinct to help her. The whispers around him grew louder, their tones insistent, almost pleading. They shouldn't have let her in, the voices murmured, overlapping in a cacophony of warning. She doesn't belong. She's a threat. Oliver knelt beside the woman, his voice low but steady. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to ground himself in the moment. "Claire," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me. They're coming." Oliver's stomach churned. "Who's coming?" he asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint light of the symbols on the walls flickered ominously. The shadows that had once lingered at the edges of his vision now began to move, creeping toward the center of the room like ink spreading across water. Claire gasped, her eyes widening in terror. "Do you see them?" she whispered, clutching Oliver's arm. "They're here." Oliver nodded, his jaw tightening. The Watchers had returned, their presence more tangible than ever. Their glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, their forms shifting and writhing as they advanced. "Stay behind me," Oliver said, his voice firm. He stood, positioning himself between Claire and the approaching shadows. The whispers surged around him, their tones filled with urgency. "You must choose," the voices hissed. "The house or her." Oliver felt the weight of the house pressing down on him, its presence demanding his obedience. But he couldn't ignore Claire's fear, the desperate look in her eyes. He had been chosen to protect the house, but what kind of protector would he be if he let someone suffer in its walls? The man in the suit appeared at the edge of the room, his hollow eyes fixed on Oliver. "You know the rules," he said, his voice calm yet unyielding. "The house does not tolerate outsiders." Oliver clenched his fists. "She's not a threat," he said. "She needs help." The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "And if helping her destroys the barrier, if it unleashes what lies within." Oliver hesitated, his chest tightening. The man's words echoed with truth, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon Claire. "There has to be another way," he said. The Watchers closed in, their forms towering and menacing. Claire cried out, clinging to Oliver as the room seemed to ripple with the weight of their presence. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, casting eerie light across the shifting shadows. The whispers reached a deafening pitch, and the floor beneath them began to crack. A deep, resonant voice filled the room, drowning out all other sounds. "The balance is broken. The house cannot hold." Oliver's heart raced as the room seemed to collapse around him. The walls groaned and shifted, the air thick with energy. He turned to Claire, his voice urgent. "We need to get to the altar. It's the only way." Claire nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they ran through the shifting corridors, the whispers and shadows pursuing them with relentless intensity. When they reached the altar, Oliver felt a surge of relief. The symbols etched into its surface pulsed with light, their energy pushing back the encroaching shadows. But the whispers remained, their tones sharp and accusatory. "You've endangered us all," the voices hissed. "The barrier is failing." Oliver placed his hands on the altar, the cold surface sending a shockwave through his body. He closed his eyes, focusing on the symbols, the whispers, and the energy of the house. He needed to restore the balance, to seal the rift that Claire's presence had caused. The man in the suit appeared beside him, his expression grim. "You've chosen her over the house," he said. "Now you must face the consequences." Oliver's jaw tightened. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice steady. "Tell me how to fix this." The man's gaze lingered on him for a long moment. Then, with a nod, he extended a hand toward the altar. "Give the house what it wants." The whispers grew louder, their tones filled with hunger. Oliver understood what the man meant, but the thought of sacrificing Claire made his stomach churn. She had trusted him, begged him for help, and now he was supposed to betray her. "There has to be another way," Oliver said, his voice breaking. The man's expression didn't change. "There is no other way." Oliver turned to Claire, his chest tightening. She looked at him with wide, tearful eyes, her fear and desperation cutting through him like a knife. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Oliver swallowed hard. "Stay here," he said. "I'll handle it." As Oliver stood before the altar, the whispers swirled around him, their energy growing stronger. He placed both hands on the cold surface, his mind racing as he tried to find a solution. The man in the suit stepped closer. "Make your choice, Keeper," he said. "The house will not wait." Oliver closed his eyes, his body trembling. He couldn't sacrifice Claire, but he couldn't let the house fall either. He needed to find a way to satisfy its hunger without destroying the barrier. The whispers surged, their tones desperate and pleading. Oliver took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He would give the house what it wanted, but on his terms. Oliver stepped back from the altar, his voice steady as he addressed the shadows. "Take me instead," he said. "Oh, carry the burden. I'll be what you need." The shadows froze, their glowing eyes fixed on him. The whispers fell silent, the room growing still. The man in the suit tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You would give yourself to the house?" he asked. Oliver nodded. "If it means saving her and keeping the barrier intact, yes." The man stepped closer, his hollow eyes boring into Oliver's. "Very well," he said. "The house accepts." The room grew impossibly still, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on Oliver as he stepped closer to the altar. Claire remained where she stood, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The symbols on the altar pulsed, their light growing brighter as the shadows receded slightly, drawn toward the center of the room. The man in the suit stood at the edge of the light, his presence a stark reminder of the choice Oliver had just made. His hollow gaze fixed on Oliver, and for the first time, his expression softened just barely. "You understand the cost of what you're offering," the man said, his voice low and deliberate. Oliver swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I understand," he said. "If this is what it takes to protect her, to protect the world, then I'll do it." The man nodded slowly, as if approving of Oliver's resolve. "Then it is done." As Oliver placed both hands on the altar, the symbols flared to life, their intricate patterns shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. The whispers returned, but their tone was different, now less chaotic, more purposeful. They seemed to flow into Oliver, their energy surging through his body like a current. Pain rippled through him, sharp and searing. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, a pulling sensation that seemed to reach into his very soul. Oliver clenched his teeth, his body trembling as the weight of the house began to settle onto him. The room darkened, the light from the symbols dimming, until only Oliver's form was illuminated. The shadows swirled around him, their presence no longer menacing but almost reverent. The house had accepted him, its new keeper. Claire watched in silence, her face pale. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" Oliver turned to her, his expression calm despite the pain coursing through him. "You're safe now," he said. "You can go." The man in the suit stepped forward, gesturing toward the stairs. "The house has no use for her now," he said. "She is free to leave." Claire hesitated, her gaze flicking between Oliver and the man. "I don't want to leave you here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't fair." Oliver managed a faint smile. "It's what has to be done," he said. "You don't belong here." "I do now." The man's hollow gaze fell on Claire. "Go," he said firmly. "The house will not wait." Reluctantly, Claire nodded. She stepped toward the stairs, her movements slow and hesitant. Before she left, she turned back to Oliver one last time. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Oliver didn't respond. He watched as she ascended the staircase, her form disappearing into the light above. The house groaned softly, its energy shifting as the door above slammed shut. The whispers intensified, their voices blending into a steady hum that resonated within Oliver. The symbols on the altar pulsed faster, their light enveloping him in a warm, golden glow. The pain he had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. He could feel the house new, walls, its corridors, its endless depths. It was alive, and it was part of him, the darkness it contained, the watchers, the shifting halls, all of it was under his control. "You are the house," the man in the suit said, his voice reverent, "and the house is you." Oliver turned to him, his mind still reeling from the transformation. "What happens now?" he asked. The man tilted his head, his hollow eyes glinting faintly. "Now, you protect. You endure. The house will hold, as long as you remain strong." Days turned into weeks, though time within the house felt fluid, stretching and compressing in ways Oliver couldn't fully comprehend. He wandered the halls, exploring rooms that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking. Each space held remnants of the house's past objects and memories that whispered of those who had come before him. The Watchers appeared frequently, their shadowy forms observing him from a distance. They never spoke, but Oliver could sense their approval or disapproval depending on his actions. He came to understand their role as guardians, extensions of the house's will. The man in the suit returned occasionally, his presence a constant reminder of the balance Oliver was tasked with maintaining. "The house will test you," he warned during one visit. "It will push you to your limits, but you must never falter." One night, as Oliver sat in the parlor, the whispers grew louder, their tones sharp and discordant. He stood, his chest tightening as the air grew colder. The symbols on the walls flickered erratically, their light dimming and brightening in a chaotic rhythm. Oliver followed the whispers, his steps guided by an unseen force. They led him to the basement, where the altar pulsed faintly, its glow weaker than before. The Watchers were gathered there, their forms restless, their glowing eyes fixed on him. "The barrier is weakening," the whispers said. "Something stirs within." Oliver approached the altar, his hand brushing against its cold surface. He could feel the darkness beneath the house, a presence that had been contained for centuries, but now seemed to be pressing against its restraints. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The whispers didn't answer. The man in the suit appeared beside him, his expression grim. "This is the test," he said. "Prove your worth, Keeper, or the house will fall." The room trembled, and the shadows around the altar began to coalesce into a single form. It was massive, its shape shifting and writhing as though it were made of pure energy. Glowing eyes emerged from its depths, their gaze locking onto Oliver. The whispers fell silent, leaving only the sound of Oliver's heartbeat echoing in his ears. He gripped the edge of the altar, his resolve hardening. This was his duty, Nauta, protect the house, to contain the darkness, no matter the cost. He stepped forward, his voice firm as he addressed the creature. "You don't belong here," he said. "You will not escape." The creature roared, its form expanding as it surged toward him. Oliver raised his hands, the symbols on the walls flaring brightly as he summoned the house's energy. The watchers moved closer, their forms merging with the light, creating a barrier around the altar. The battle had begun. The creature's roar reverberated through the basement, shaking the very foundation of the house. Shadows writhed and twisted, filling the cavernous space with an overwhelming darkness. Oliver stood firm, the glowing symbols on the walls and altar casting faint light against the encroaching void. The watchers closed ranks, their towering forms creating a barrier of shifting shadow and glowing eyes. The whispers surged around them, their tones filled with urgency and determination. This was a battle that had been fought countless times before, but it was new for Oliver, test of his resolve, his strength, and his right to be the house's keeper. The creature lunged, its massive form surging toward Oliver like a tidal wave of darkness. The watchers moved as one, their forms colliding with the creature in a burst of shadow and light. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, the air rippling with energy. Oliver gripped the altar, his body trembling as he felt the house's power coursing through him. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their intricate patterns shifting and twisting in response to the battle. He closed his eyes, focusing on the connection between himself and the house. "This is my responsibility," he muttered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I won't let it escape." The creature roared again, its form pressing against the watcher's barrier. It lashed out, tendrils of shadow slicing through the air with deadly precision. One struck the altar, sending a jolt of energy through Oliver's body. Oliver staggered but didn't fall. He placed both hands on the altar, channeling the house's energy into the barrier. The symbols on his skin marks he hadn't noticed until new began to glow, their light merging with the patterns on the walls. The watchers turned to him, their glowing eyes filled with a strange sense of approval. They shifted, their forms becoming more solid as they absorbed the energy Oliver provided. The barrier strengthened, pushing the creature back with a force that shook the room. The whispers grew louder, their tones filled with encouragement. "You are the keeper," they said. "The house is yours. Command it." Oliver took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He raised his hands, the symbols on his arms flaring brightly. "Return to the shadows," he commanded, his voice echoing through the room. "You will not break free." The creature howled, its form collapsing inward as the barrier closed around it. The watchers pressed forward, their combined strength forcing the darkness back into the depths of the house. The altar pulsed with light, its symbols blazing as the creature was drawn into its core. The room trembled one final time before falling still. The darkness receded, the watchers returning to their places along the walls. The whispers faded into silence, leaving only the faint hum of the house's energy. Oliver collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The battle was over, but he knew it was only the beginning. The house had tested him, and he had proven himself, but the darkness within its walls was eternal, and the fight would never truly end. The man in the suit appeared beside the altar, his hollow eyes fixed on Oliver. "You have done well," he said, his voice calm. "The house is safe for now." Oliver looked up at him, his chest heaving. "Will it ever end?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Will the house ever stop needing a keeper?" The man's expression didn't change. "The house endures because you endure," he said. "As long as there is darkness, there will be a need for someone to contain it." Oliver nodded slowly, the weight of his responsibility settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I understand," he said. "I'll do what needs to be done." The man tilted his head, his gaze lingering on Oliver for a moment. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The days that followed were quiet. The house seemed to recognize Oliver's resolve, its shifting halls and groaning walls settling into a calm rhythm. The watchers appeared less frequently, their forms fading into the background as Oliver moved through the rooms. He spent hours exploring the house, uncovering hidden passages and forgotten artifacts. Each discovery brought him closer to understanding the house's history and the role he now played within it. The whispers became a constant companion, their tones guiding him as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The altar remained the heart of the house, its glowing symbols a reminder of the power Oliver now wielded. He visited it often, placing his hands on its cold surface and feeling the house's energy flow through him. It was both a comfort and a burden, a constant reminder of the balance he was tasked with maintaining. One evening, as Oliver sat in the parlor, he heard a sound that made his heart skip a beat. It was faint, barely audible over the murmur of the whispers, but it was there, a soft, lilting laugh. He stood, his pulse quickening as he followed the sound. It led him to the front door, which creaked open as he approached. Outside, the night was calm, the stars shining brightly in the clear sky. At the edge of the porch stood Claire. Her form was faint, almost translucent, but her smile was warm and real. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for saving me." Oliver felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Claire nodded. "Because of you, I am," she said. "The house may hold the darkness, but it also holds light. Don't forget that." Her form began to fade, her smile lingering for a moment before disappearing into the night. Oliver stood there for a long time, the weight of her words settling over him like a balm. As Oliver returned to the house, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since arriving. The darkness would always be there, waiting to test him, but so would the light. The house was a prison, but it was also a sanctuary, a place where balance was maintained, and the world above was kept safe. He was its keeper now, its guardian, its protector, and though the burden was heavy, he carried it willingly, knowing that the house had chosen him for a reason. As he placed his hands on the altar once more, the symbols flared brightly, their light filling the room. The whispers rose around him, their tones filled with purpose, and Oliver knew, deep in his soul, that he had found his place.